consumed her was to put an end to the very person who caused that pain. She did so by stabbing Michael Ritchie intentionally in his heart and then stabbed him again in his back. Cut his back, and I suggest to you, he injured his hands trying to defend himself from that armed woman with a knife filled with rage. Ladies and gentlemen, part of your jobs is to look at the evidence, and what's in evidence is very different than what defense counsel just spent 15 minutes of your precious time speculating about. What ifs? What ifs are not evidence. What's evidence is your memories of what those witnesses testified to. What's evidence, ladies and gentlemen, are these knives, text messages, scene videos, the state of affairs in the house, and Michael Ritchie's injuries created by Christine Ricci. That's evidence, ladies and gentlemen. Speculation? That's not it. Part of your jobs, ladies and gentlemen, is not just to look at the evidence, remember, and it's your memories I govern, what the witnesses said under oath. But there's other things that I think you should consider. You should also consider, ladies and gentlemen, although we don't need to prove it, motive. What kind of motive? Well, motive for Christine Ricci to commit this crime. I suggest that's abundantly clear from the evidence. Her jealousy was her motive. What else? Motive for each and every witness under oath to take that witness stand and tell you what they did. And you're allowed to consider who they are, perhaps what their affinity is towards in terms of who they're trying to protect or who they're trying to defend. You're allowed to consider all of that. Although we don't need to prove it, the motive for Christine to do what she did. What else can you consider? Not just motive, but opportunity. Did Christine Ricci have the opportunity, the ability to do this gruesome act? I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear that this is a woman who has tried to do this before. This is a woman whose knife of choice are the very knives that she used to kill her husband. Did she have the opportunity? I suggest that's abundantly clear. Something else that might be helpful for you to be considering, you'll hear this word a lot, is corroboration. Not just that somebody says something, but why else should you believe what they're saying to be true? That's corroboration, basically, in layman's terms. Why should you believe what Michael Richie Jr. said? Well, part of that is to look to the other evidence, to see if what he said, for example, matches up. And perhaps if it matches up with other people's recount of events, perhaps you could lend more credibility to that. That's corroboration, ladies and gentlemen. You heard a lot from many different people for a very long time. I don't need to remind you. But what I'm going to do right now is summarize the evidence. And again, the judge will inform you, and I'll tell you now, it's your memory, it's not my memory. But I'll do my best to summarize accurately, not speculating, what was said. You heard first from Sophia Ricci. Clearly a difficult time for her. Clearly she still loves her father and her mother that stands on trial for murder. What did she tell you, ladies and gentlemen? She told you that she had a happy childhood. And then everything changed in the fall of 2018, which is kind of a common theme amongst everyone in that home. And they're testifying. What else did she tell you? She told you that on January 28, 2021, she heard yelling. She got home from school around 2 o'clock. So in terms of a timeline, defense counsel has tried to establish that there's a 15-minute segment. There's been no proof of that, ladies and gentlemen. The only times, if I could remind you, that we know of is that Sophia Ricci got home that day at 2 o'clock. We know that Michael Ritchie went to Dunkin' Donuts at 2:20 because you have the video footage of that. And then we know that upon him coming home, that's when Sophia Ritchie heard yelling and banging, as you might recall. And then the next piece of timeline we know about is approximately 4:48 when 911 was called. That's your timeline, ladies and gentlemen. Need not speculate. That's your timeline, and we know this because it's in evidence. And what else did she say? She said she heard the banging, she heard the yelling, and her quote was, "I'm used to it." She's used to it because it happens all the time. You heard it from multiple witnesses in that home. It was a daily occurrence. And what was it always about? It was always about the affair. She was obsessed, I suggest to you. So Sophia was used to this. Nothing new here, but this differed on this one occasion because her mother yelled to her, "Sophia!" She runs down the stairs. "Call 911. Defense has tried to establish that maybe the defendant was so inconsolable and nobody can understand anything she said. Well, Sophia heard her call her name pretty clearly. Sophia then testified that she heard her mother tell her, "Call 911. And then the next thing she told her to do was go upstairs and get her cell phone. So this is a woman who defense wants you to perhaps believe through the evidence that was incomprehensible and not, you're unable to understand her. Maybe she told everyone about this daddy and nobody heard her. Well, you heard from her own daughter that she heard her quite clearly on those 3 separate occasions. What else did Sophia tell you? That her mother did not tell her what had happened. Why is that important? Because it corroborates the fact that the defendant also didn't tell any of the first responders. So again, looking for corroboration. Why believe the first responders? Look to Sophia. Why believe Sophia's account? Look to the first responders. That's corroboration. She also told you her parents were fighting weekly. She said 1 to 2 years before this event on January 28th, she did see a bruise on her father's face following an argument with her mother over the affair, I suggest to you. She recalls her mother would be repeatedly, again a common theme, repeatedly asking for details about the affair. And when he wouldn't remember or say he wouldn't remember the details, she would get upset. And her quote was, "She needed to know the details." Again, I suggest to you the evidence is clear. This woman was obsessed with learning every ounce about that 6-week affair. She also testified that her mother tended to start the arguments. Also, she said, her father, the alleged victim in this matter, Michael Ritchie, was never, ever violent. With her, with her mother, with anyone. So when you're trying to think about, I know Michael Ritchie's not here to tell us about himself, think to all the people who knew him best. When you're trying to think about what kind of man this was, and by no means, ladies and gentlemen, do we condone an affair or his behavior or think that lots of drinking is okay. By no means is this a perfect individual. But you heard a lot more other things about it. In fact, you heard, and I'll go through the evidence, that upon the affair being revealed, that man, Michael Ritchie, did everything possible He did everything possible to save and salvage the family he loved so much. Everything. Angel Ritchie testified to. Again, difficult. Difficult for these children, I call them children, they're adults, to have to come in here testifying about their mother when their father is no longer with them. What did he tell you? He was adopted by Michael Ritchie in 2004, called him Dad. After, had a happy childhood, after the fall of 2018, found out about the affair, he noticed changes in his mom. What were those changes? She was more secluded. She was angry. She yelled a lot. In fact, his quote was, and again, it's your memories that govern, there was no getting away from it. The fights were ongoing. She was persistent about getting the truth. He explained that his father picked up the slack, and his quote was, tried to fix everything that was going on in the house. He explained that typically during fights between his parents, what would his father do? Again, trying to piece together what kind of man Michael Richie was. He, I suggest to you, was the diffuser. She was the instigator, as the evidence showed. He diffused it. How do we know this? Everyone testified that lived in that home what he would do during an argument. He would remove himself. He would walk outside and smoke a cigarette. What else did he testify to? That on Mother's Day of 2020, and he had trouble with dates, and I want to get to that, ladies and gentlemen. Trouble with dates and confusing incidents. I ask you to think, when you're using your common sense, imagine for a moment, last year you witnessed 12 accidents. And then you were asked to come in and talk about every single detail of every single accident. Do you think you could do it? I mean, maybe. But compare that to one accident that you witnessed. Probably your memory would be a little bit easier to reconstruct about what you saw, what you heard, what you know. I suggest to you, this was repeated abuse at the hands of this woman to Michael Richie. And lots of people saw it, and there were lots of different events. And because of that, I suggest to you, how disturbing is that? Her own kids can't keep track of all the times and all the different incidences that their mother hurt their father. So think about that for a minute when you're thinking about, well, should we believe him? I mean, he got confused a little bit with dates. Well, what he did say on redirect, as you might recall, is that on Mother's Day 2020, the same incident for corroborative purposes that Katrina testified to, that he referred to as mom poking self with knife incidents. He gets home, his parents were fighting about the affair, his mother was hysterical, there were things broken. He sees his mother grab a big Japanese-style knife and appears she was going to plunge it into herself. Angel, her son, calls for his father to go help. And the two of them are able to get that knife out of her hands and hide all the other knives. He said his father was, quote, trying to do what he did every day. Just deal with it. He also indicated the defendant and the situation progressively got worse. Moving on, you heard from Officer Hunt and Officer Martin, two of the two first police officers to respond to the scene on January 28, 2021. They both believed they were dispatched for a medical. Why is that important? Because that's what was told to them through Sophia, because the defendant failed to tell anyone what she had just done. Why? That's called consciousness of guilt. She's trying to hide what she had just done because she knew what she had just done. Not sure how she thought she'd get away with them finding the stab wounds, but that's not for us to decide. Officer Hunt testified that the defendant was upset, distraught, difficult to understand. However, when Officer Kelly asked, only after they find the stab wound from the EMTs, Captain Smith testified to this, they ran in and said to the defendant, who stabbed him? Only then does she say, that's what I've been saying, he's bipolar and schizophrenic. Unfortunately, that is not what she was saying. And that's unfortunate for Michael Richie. Because had she said she stabbed him, perhaps the help would have been quicker or different, or the response would have been different altogether. She then indicates further detail to help herself, consciousness of guilt, and self-serving statements. She took a knife out of the kitchen drawer to defend herself. Again, she never says this until they find the stab wound. I suggest she had plenty of time to manufacture a story that would help her during all the time it was taking for them trying to save Michael Ritchie's life. And I suggest to you, all of these first responders had years of training, and they all testified to it. They're used to traumatic events. You better believe that if any of those 4 men that testified under oath, or 5 men testified under oath, they did not hear her say anything about a stabbing, I suggest to you, you could believe that. Because had she said anything remotely sounding like, I stabbed him, or he came at me and I had to stab him, they would have responded differently. That's what their jobs are for, to respond and help. And know what? Their help is only as good as the information provided. And she failed miserably with that. Officer Martin also testified that the defendant told him conveniently, he had a manic episode and just collapsed. Again, self-serving statement. Tells them nothing about the situation so that they could help him appropriately. And no trouble understanding those statements, her self-serving statements. Only after confronted with the stab wounds, Officer Martin said it all kind of came together, and they all realized that she had just stabbed him. Even if you believe her self-serving statements, that he had a manic episode or that he lunged at her, even if you believe that, ladies and gentlemen, which I suggest the evidence proves you should not believe that, but it's up to you, I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, how does that explain all of the other injuries? If he lunged at her, maybe that would explain the 1 wound. How do you claim self-defense, ladies and gentlemen, or that you had to be put in that situation when you also stabbed him in his back? She stabbed him in his back. She stabbed him in his heart. And never told anyone until they found those wounds. Robert Higgins testified, Bobby, from AA, you might recall. He testified that a few weeks before his friend Michael Ritchie died, he saw him, and he saw him looking tired, gaunt. He looked like a man, I suggest to you, that suffered 2+ years of verbal and physical abuse at her hands. That's who he saw. I suggest to you he was fairly unrecognizable. And what does that corroborate with? Michael Jr.'s testimony about when he went to visit his father at the fire station. What else did he say? That's if you're questioning whether or not to believe her kids about all the broken things she used to have around the house. What did he take her shopping for? Mirrors. Lee Rivera testified from DCF, you might recall. Why is her testimony important? Again, looking for corroboration and why you should believe certain people's testimony versus others. She testified to the same event, I suggest to you, that Michael Jr. testified to, which was the June 6, 2019 incident where ultimately he described, and I'll get to it, Michael Jr., that his mother was going after his father with a knife, running towards the father, like this. And he then, DCF becomes involved because Michael Jr. is so fed up, so tired, so upset by everything going on for the last 2+ years, or actually for the last year, because then he moves out, that he punches a wall. And then ultimately goes to the hospital after a friend tells him, you gotta go treat that. Goes to the hospital and they file a 51A report. Lee Rivera does an investigation, and in the course of her investigation, she meets with the defendant, Christine Ricci. And why is that important? Well, Christine Ricci says, yet again, she and her husband were arguing about the affair, and her husband became upset because she continued to bring it up. Michael Jr. gets home and yells at them to stop. This is all her words to Lee Rivera. She then says, so when curious about, can we believe all the statements about Christine? In her own words, Christine says, I was in a fit of rage and grabbed a mirror in my bedroom and smashed it on the floor. She also denies any physical abuse. Interestingly enough, Christine Ricci is showing kind of a pattern here. She tells just a little bit, just like on January 28, 2021. She fails to tell the whole story. And the rest of the whole story is that she grabbed a knife and went after her husband on June 6, 2019. She stopped short of that. However, the important part is she was in a fit of rage. Her own words. Detective Davis testified. I won't get into too much detail, but he basically summarized everything that transpired from the moment that the police got involved all the way through to all the testing of the evidence that you have at your fingertips. You found out that through crime scene investigators and the state police that there were many things collected. You have Michael Ritchie's shirts in evidence. I asked you to take a look at the holes in those shirts, ladies and gentlemen, signifying where Christine Ricci stabbed him. I suggest you also have the knives in evidence that have, for all intents and purposes in layman's terms, you heard the lab technicians or crime scene talk about and DNA experts. Michael Ritchie's blood's on those two knives. Those two knives are in evidence. One of those knives matches the very knife by the feet of Michael Ritchie that you'll see a picture of. That's in evidence. His blood, not her blood, his blood. What else is important? Her shirt was taken into evidence. What is to have on it? His blood. I suggest you heard from Mark McDonald, Uncle Mac, we'll call him, who was a very close friend of the entire Ritchie family. Yes, Michael Ritchie was his best friend. He called him his brother. But he also was handpicked to be Sophia's godfather. That's how important he was to this family, how close he was to the family. And what did he tell you? He told you that he would go Thirsty Thursdays with Michael Ritchie, and they'd go to the BBC in Pembroke. He also described to you that he actually saw scratches on Michael Ritchie, a bleeding nose, fat lip, and he observed this all following the fall of 2018, which is when the affair was disclosed. He indicated that Michael Ritchie stopped looking like the Mike he knew after the affair was revealed. He was more quiet, withdrawn. I suggest to you he looked like the battered man that he was. He also told you about two interesting events. Told you about the time that Christine Ricci and Michael Ritchie surprised him at work. You might recall. And Christine Ricci did 90% of the talking, and it was supposedly for part of his AA treatment to make amends, which is interesting considering Michael spoke almost nothing. And how did he describe Michael? And again, getting to know Michael through the words of other people who are closest to him. Michael looked tired during this meeting, hunched over, only looking up at the very end. Not the same guy he knew and loved. And interestingly enough, that was an example of not just how Michael appeared during this, what I submit to you as an abusive relationship, but also how Christine appeared and the changes in her personality, which corroborates a lot of other witness testimony. Janine Bouchard, for example. Michael Jr., for example. And what he told you was that the defendant, Christine Ricci, not only did most of the talking, but was calm in the beginning, and then all of a sudden, something triggered her, I suggest, and she snapped and started screaming. This is at a place of business, to the point where he asked her to stop. Please be quiet. Help them to leave. He described it as night and day from when she first walked in the door. And he said, Michael Ritchie never said a word while she was screaming. That was the last time he saw his best friend. And then thereafter, he could no longer contact him on the phone number. No longer worked. What else did he tell you? The incident about when the defendant was trying to find Janine. And what did he tell you about that? He got a call from Michael Ritchie. And although he wasn't, you didn't hear any testimony about what that conversation entailed, he was worried and asked him to call her. So he called the defendant. Again, they have years and years of a relationship together. I suggest there was a lot of love between this whole family and Matt. And he called the defendant, and he said that the defendant said, I'm trying to find Janine. She was angry. Then she became calm. Then she started laughing. And then her tone changed, became angry. And then all of a sudden, she came upon mailboxes, which had Janine's last name, I suggest to you, as well as a Richie, ironically. The Richie name was on another mailbox right next door. And she began to become erratic, screaming, he said. He had to calm her down. He also described, ladies and gentlemen, that according to his observations, Michael Richie was doing anything and everything to save his marriage. If that meant going to AA, that's what he would do. If that meant he stopped drinking, that's what he would do. Go to therapy? Sure. Anything. Anything. While he's doing anything and everything, she's berating him, hitting him, yelling at him, but he doesn't give up. Michael Dillon, the fire chief, testified. He testified that he knows Michael Richie very well. Why? They work together. In April of 2017, Michael Richie was asked and vetted to be his aide. You might recall I kind of described it kind of like a golf caddy. He kind of helped him with decisions, where to go, what to do. He was his right-hand man. And he discusses the criteria he used to pick an aide. Steady head, very responsible, well-liked, great at completing tasks. And what did he say? Michael Richie exceeded the criteria. Why is that important, ladies and gentlemen? Well, defense has tried to elicit evidence and make you believe that Michael Richie was this raging alcoholic. When? First of all, so remote from when this incident occurred that if the understanding is perhaps he was such a raging alcoholic that prompted the stabbing, nothing is in evidence about that. So we're talking about basically the same time that he was handpicked to be a fire chief's aide. He wants you, or he's arguing, that you should think that Michael Richie was this raging alcoholic. I suggest to you, he testified that he saw no observations of anything remotely lending to that story. He also testified that he made certain observations that are important. 2019, 2 black eyes. His affect, Michael Richie, somber. A few months before the January 28th incident, he came to work with 1 black eye. A week before, I suggest he was murdered, scratches on his neck. He also indicated that he had no concerns about anything that Michael Richie was doing outside of work. With his memory, his drinking, nothing. Katrina Freeman. Why is she important, ladies and gentlemen? I suggest to you she has no skin in this game. The last contact she had with this family, first of all, it's not her family. She's no longer in the family. She's no longer dating Angel. It's been years, but she was privy to 4 years of what was going on in that house. 4 years. And I ask that you think back to her testimony. She moved in there 2017 into the Ritchie household and lived there until 1 month before this defendant stabbed Michael Richie. And during that time, she said initially in 2017, things were pretty great. Family dinners, they did a lot of laughing, watching movies. She was very close to Christine Ricci during the entire time, even when things were not good in the home. They still maintained a close relationship. In fact, when Christine Ricci discovered the affair, who did she reach out to? Katrina Freeman, and asked that she and Angel come see her. After that event, that prompted Katrina and Angel to go to that friend's house where you might have remembered Christine Ricci seemed different. She was smoking. She doesn't usually smoke, and then she proceeded to tell them he had an affair, and we're done. Basically, he's moving out. And then she said, but a few days later, everything changed. She said, actually, we're going to start to work on it. We're going to just work on this. It's going to work. She also testified that after that affair was revealed in the fall of 2018, the house was depressing, fighting constantly. The defendant, only the defendant, was always yelling, crying, and asking questions about the affair. She said that she actually talked about it at the end of 2018, where the defendant punched the victim in the face. Where the defendant punched the alleged victim in the face, Michael Ritchie. And how do we know this? She didn't witness it, but she heard the fight, and then the defendant told her about it. I punched him in the face. And then she recalls her getting medical treatment for her hand. She remembered the defendant screaming, "I want answers!" She needed details. It was fueling her. She needed to know more. She indicated Katrina that the defendant stayed in her room most of the time. She was surprised that Michael Ritchie went to AA because she never saw him abuse alcohol. I suggest to you the defendant planted the seed of alcoholism. I mean, we're not saying the defendant or Michael Ritchie didn't drink, and maybe drank too much occasionally. But I suggest to you that the evidence has showed that she planted this idea in people's head because she needed some reason to understand why he could ever do these things. And she was embarrassed, I suggest. So that was the story that was going to be. He's an alcoholic, makes bad choices, and look at this. Because of alcohol, he cheated on me. She also stated that he stopped seeing friends. She never saw any issue with memory loss. And when I asked her specifically, did you ever see injuries to Christine Ricci, other than when she punched him in the face? And she indicated, yes, actually. I would see cuts on her hands. And I said, did you know how those were caused? And she said, yeah, they were self-inflicted. Think about that for a moment when you're looking at photographs. She also talked about the Mother's Day 2020 incident, again, corroborative of other people's testimony about the very same incident, where the defendant held a knife to her chest. Katrina got home. Mother's Day is hard. She had been drinking. She went inside and then ultimately went down and saw the defendant on the ground with a knife being held against her. And Angel and who? Michael Sr. were trying to help her, trying to get the knife away, a common theme. Trying to help the very woman that ultimately kills him, I suggest. Janine Bouchard testified, the other woman. You don't need to like what happened, but I suggest to you, she shared enough of what her mindset was, and that was based on what Michael Ritchie told her. And then the defendant adopted it, I suggest, by saying, he told me you guys were done. You weren't wearing your wedding bands. You were seeing someone else. He told me you guys were done. And she said, well, yeah. She agreed. And then at which point Janine said, this was during one of the many conversations, she said, well, then if that's the case, what? I know, I should have waited probably until you were divorced, but if you're saying all these things, what? I'm sorry, but I'm not sure it's kind of as bad as it's being made out to be, if you guys were done anyway. She also said, ladies and gentlemen, that their affair was brief, 6 weeks toward the end of the summer of 2018. And Columbus Day, Thursday of Columbus Day, she indicated, there had been some sort of a plan. She believed that Michael Ritchie was going to be sitting down with the family to let them know that he's no longer going to be with Christine Ricci. And then a couple of days later, surprisingly, she gets this random call from Michael Ritchie doing a total about-face, saying, you never meant anything to me, in a monotone voice. You never meant anything to me. I love my wife. I never loved you. Big change. Totally understandable that he could change his mind or think differently or who knows. But that's what you heard under oath. She then indicated that after that conversation, she was done, I suggest. Their relationship was over. Yet, she kept getting calls. Missed calls from Michael Ritchie's phone. And then on November 6, 2018, you have it as an exhibit, the defendant texted Janine. And I'm not going to go through it all, but basically just about how this woman has ruined her life, taken her man, it's her man. You could read that yourself. And then December 2019, just showing the pattern during the same time of aggression by the defendant. The defendant, unannounced, shows up at her house at night, knocked on the door, screaming, how could you do this to me? This is my husband, screaming and crying. And what is she saying to her? I'm truly sorry. I thought you guys were done. Again, not wearing the rings. Thought you were seeing somebody. And what was her response, I asked? She agreed. All true. The defendant said during that conversation that during any of the two conversations that she spoke to Michael Ritchie when he was breaking up with her and ending things, that Christine Ricci was on the phone. So when we talk about controlling his phone, look no further. That's one example. She also indicated, Janine, that the defendant needed details, was demanding details. She was crying, angry, then calm, then yelling. She was all over the place on that event. Now fast forward to January 30th, 2020. More text from the defendant needing to talk to Janine. She needs to know about more dates, needs to know. And Janine said, no, not going to do this. Now fast forward, March 18th, 2020. That's the daughter event with Janine, where her daughter had to call the police because this woman wouldn't leave her home. The defendant comes, won't leave, and screaming the entire time, I need to talk to her, I need to talk to her. And Janine said, you tell her I'm not talking to her. Look, this is the second time she's come to her house at night, unannounced, demanding answers, refusing to leave. Only leaves when the police get there. She described Michael Ritchie as kind, sweet, calm. She actually never saw him drunk and never noticed any memory issues. You also heard, ladies and gentlemen, from Michael Richie Jr. He described to you, ladies and gentlemen, what it was like living in that home. What did he tell you? The defendant, who he calls the defendant, constantly bringing up the affair. Do you love her? Are you going to start a family with her? Have you had sex with her? Never, ever, during any argument, did he testify that he ever heard his father screaming or yelling. Only his mother. He would, the defendant would keep asking Michael Ritchie the same questions over and over again. And then in 2018 to 2019, he saw his father get punched in the face by his mother. Who does that corroborate? Katrina Freeman's testimony of the same event, where the defendant told her, yeah, I punched him in the face. He talked about how he would overhear his father say, stop hitting me. He would hear furniture breaking. House was shaking. He would come home from work and see shattered items all over. A golf club broken into, a glass door, a glass table, mirrors cracked. And then he talked about June 6, 2019, when he broke his hand, the knife incident. He indicated he was watching TV with the defendant. All was well. And then the defendant went upstairs. It's the middle of the day. He says his father comes home, asks, where's mom? Up the stairs. He goes up. At that point, the defendant, he hears them fighting, Michael Jr. He goes upstairs. The defendant grabs a mirror and throws it to the ground and yells, get out! And he sees his father say, all right, I'm out. And he walks out. And where does he go? Same place he always goes during a fight, to defuse the situation. Get away from her. Let her calm down. He goes outside to smoke a cigarette. The very door that was so close to where this defendant killed him. He indicated that after his father left the room, he tried to calm his mother down, and then his mother got more and more angry, saying, you're siding with him, you're siding with him. She runs downstairs, he follows after her, she grabs a knife, and she holds it out. He described it with his hand, and I put it on the record in a right angle I described. And he indicated from hid body, and I suggest it's your memories that govern, running, he said she was running towards where my father had just went out. Body forward, I suggest. What is that indicative of? Does that sound like somebody who's going to use a knife on herself? Perhaps her mindset shifted a little bit. When she knew she couldn't go after him, she then maybe wanted to use it on herself, which was a pattern. We don't know, but we can only find that out from the one eyewitness to that, and that's her own son, who told you exactly what he saw that day. And he was scared. And he was scared that she was going to hurt her, his own father, I suggest to you, and scared she was going to then hurt herself. What did he tell you? She was angry, hostile, incoherent, hysterical, at which point he yelled to his father, come in, grab all the knives. At that point, he said his mother then, he had to wrestle, put her arms behind her back. Finally, the knife was released from her hand. The situation appeared to be calm, and then his mother ran back up the stairs, where she had just smashed a mirror, and he was scared she was going to do something upstairs. So he followed her upstairs, at which point he was so angry, so done, so upset about the years he's been watching this and hearing this happen, he punched a wall. What else did he tell you? The defendant would look through his father's phone. His father hadn't changed his number, or did change his number. Don't know why. His father was isolated from friends, including his best friend and godfather, Matt. What else did he tell you? Family meetings. Not sure if you recall that line of testimony, but let me paint the picture that he testified to. He described it as one of the many, many times that the defendant would say, I need answers, I need more details, I need them, I need them, I need them. And then when she would find out a little bit more, she'd call everyone in. Her kids. His father would be sitting in a chair with the defendant standing over him, sharing with them the new details she found out about their father. And she'd be screaming at their father. He also described, ladies and gentlemen, that the one-year trip at AA, it looked like he wasn't allowed to say a word, him describing how his father appeared. He then described, ladies and gentlemen, that he visited his father for the very last time he saw him, 4 days before January 28th. And what did he describe? His father lost weight, had gray hairs, bags under his eyes, some bruising that he now recalls. They had a 3-hour talk. And what prompted this, ladies and gentlemen, was a call from Sophia, who I suggest did everything to try to paint a little bit, minimalize kind of what was happening in that house, and I understand that. I get it. But Sophia had called them to say, they're still fighting. They just keep fighting. At which point, Junior took matters into his own hand, went to the firehouse. You have the text message saying, I'm here, can I stop by? And proceeded to talk to his father for 3 hours, man to man, saying, stand up for yourself. You're not happy. Show courage to Sophia and Angel. And what was his father doing? Not much talking, but a lot of crying. Imagine, his son was kind of fathering him. And then it ended with a hug. I love you. He described that his father was his hero. He described that his father, he observed no issues with memory or with alcohol. He was only told these things by his mother. And he then ended by talking about why defense counsel asked, well, you resented him, or you resented her because she kept bringing up the affair. Like, maybe that's why you're testifying this way. I think it's the insinuation. And he said, well, yeah, she brought up the affair every day. She also was aggressive, physical, and violent. Dr. Martinez was the tail end of all the witnesses that he sat through. I need not remind you, but she described that the Michael Richie Sr. was 5'10". So even though Angel testified at 6'4", he was 5'10". That was what the doctor said. She measured him. It's in his chart. And she described that she examined Michael Richie's body. He had a stab wound in his heart that was 3 centimeters in length, about 15 centimeters in depth. Through the probe, they realized this. And that wound path went through subcutaneous soft tissue, piercing through his rib cartilage, his pericardium, piercing his heart in multiple places, and causing an accumulation of blood around his heart and a collapsed lung. That's just one wound. Then, turned him over, where the defendant had stabbed him in the back left shoulder, and described that as a 3.1 centimeter in length by 6.6 centimeter depth through soft tissue and muscles of the back. Then she described a third wound, an incised wound to his back, and then fresh abrasions to his hands. That's what Dr. Martinez said, and she confirmed that, not that it's any surprise, he died from the stab wound to his heart. That was the evidence, ladies and gentlemen. As I recall it, again, your memories govern. So if I'm wrong about a detail, it's your memories. And you heard a lot about other acts, and the judge will instruct you on it as she's done throughout the trial. But I suggest to you, the Commonwealth is not trying to distract you with the bad acts. You need to know about the pattern of conduct and the level of hostility that this woman had for her husband. You deserve to know about that, because else you're not knowing the full picture. It would seem isolated. You also, ladies and gentlemen, these other injuries, these other acts, it also can be used to negate any claim of accident or self-defense. And again, you'll hear all of this in the judge's instructions, I suggest. But the fact of the matter is, had you not had the benefit of hearing about all the other abusive behavior at her hands, perhaps you might maybe give a little bit of credence to the defense counsel's closing argument, 15 minutes of pure, unadulterated speculation, not based on evidence. But you have the benefit from so many people hearing and telling you about so many injuries, black eyes, scratches, bloody nose, bloody lip. This went on for 2+ years. Michael Ritchie became Christine Ricci's human punching bag. She took out her anger, aggression, embarrassment, jealousy, and rage on the man that she supposedly loved so much that had cheated on her for 6 weeks. Defense counsel, ladies and gentlemen, argued a little bit about heat of passion, and you're going to be instructed on it. There's something called heat of passion on reasonable provocation. You're going to be instructed on it. I suggest to you that you would need to find that this defendant was provoked by Michael Ritchie. And how do we know she wasn't? Look to the past. There's not one piece of evidence to suggest to you that on this day or any other day that he provoked anything. He was the diffuser, the calm one, the one who removed himself from situations, the one who wrestled knives out of his wife's hands so she wouldn't hurt herself. That's who Michael Ritchie was. So there was no heat of passion due to reasonable provocation. It was the same old, same old. She wanted to erase the past, but in doing so needed answers. And when not getting answers, she couldn't handle it anymore. There was also no mental impairment on behalf of the defendant. The only evidence you heard was that she would have panic attacks. And yes, did she try to kill herself before? Sure. There's no evidence that on this particular day she was in the midst of having a panic attack when this happened, or in the midst of feeling like some sort of craziness was going on. All you know is that they were arguing, there was banging, and then she stabbed him 2 times. And the only evidence of any maybe mental impairment is afterwards. After she knew she had just killed her husband, I suggest to you. She has a panic attack. I suggest I might have one too. If I had just pierced a knife into my husband's heart. As stated in the opening, ladies and gentlemen, by my sister here, Christine Ricci was like a simmering pot of anger, jealousy, rage, and control that boiled over on January 28, 2021. She spent 2 years doing everything in her control and power to control and isolate Michael Ritchie. Yet she managed to lose all self-control in doing so. And ultimately, she picked up a knife, just like she had done on other occasions, showing that pattern, and killed her husband, Michael Ritchie. That's why we're here. It's not a pile of dirt, ladies and gentlemen. It's their lives. Find me guilty.
I'll see counsel to sign the bench.